Is there a moral argument that can be given in defense of abortion? In this lecture video, we're going to look at one such argument given by Judith Jarvis Thomson called A Defense of Abortion. Now, the first question that Thomson asks is whether it morally matters whether a fetus is a human person. Now, she thinks most opposition to abortion relies on the premise that the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception. Now, it looks impossible, she thinks, to demarcate the exact moment from fetus to human being. When do we say there's a fetus, and when does that fetus become a human being? It's not exactly clear. Now, a human is likely at some point before birth a human person. She says, indeed, it comes as a surprise when one first learns how early in life it begins to acquire human characteristics. By the 10th week, for example, it already has a face, arms and legs, fingers and toes. It has internal organs, and brain activity is detectable. But it's also likely that a fetus is not a person from the moment of conception. She says, a newly fertilized ovum, a newly implanted clump of cells, is no more a person than an acorn is an oak tree. Right? So we wouldn't say that an acorn or a seed is an oak tree or an apple. So why would we say that a clump of cells is a person? What Thomson is going to do is actually grant, for the sake of argument, that a fetus is a person. Now, the typical pro-life argument that's given works like this. First premise, every person has a right to life. Second, a fetus is a human person. Third, therefore the fetus has a right to life. 4, the mother, however, has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. 5, a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body. 6, therefore the fetus may not be killed due to concerns of bodily autonomy. And so 7, the conclusion, therefore an abortion is immoral. Basically the argument says, well, yeah, someone has a right to bodily autonomy, but bodily autonomy doesn't trump the right to life. So therefore abortion is immoral. So Thomson wants to basically take this argument and say, okay, let's see whether or not bodily autonomy actually can trump the right to life. In what circumstances might we say this, if at all? And so to consider this, she wants to say, all right, let's grant that the fetus is a human person. So let's take the argument at what seems like it's strongest. Because it seems like if, a defender of pro-choice would say, hey, if you're going to say a fetus is a human person, checkmate, I got you, because every person has a right to life. So Thomson wants to ask, though, how exactly, assuming this premise is correct, that a fetus is a human person, how exactly does this affect bodily autonomy? So to begin thinking about this, Thomson gives us an analogy, the violinist analogy. So let me actually read from that. Okay. She says, now let me ask you to imagine this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist. A famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still, they did it. And the violinist now is plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to this situation? No doubt it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness. But do you have to accede to it? What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years, or longer still? What if the director of the hospital says, "Tough luck, I agree, but you've now got to stay in bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life. Because remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. So you cannot ever be unplugged from him." I imagine, she says, that you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with that plausible-sounding argument I mentioned a moment ago, the typical pro-life argument. So she says, in this case, of course, you were kidnapped, and you didn't volunteer for the operation that plugged the violinist into your kidneys. Can those who oppose abortion on the ground I mentioned make an exception for pregnancy due to rape? Certainly. They can say that persons have a right to life only if they didn't come into existence because of rape. Or they can say that all persons have a right to life, but that some have less of a right to life than others, in particular that those who came into existence because of rape have less. But these statements have a rather unpleasant sound. Surely, the question of whether you have a right to life at all, or how much of it you have, shouldn't turn on the question of whether or not you are the product of a rape. And in fact, the people who oppose abortion on the ground I mentioned do not make this distinction, and hence do not make an exception in the case of rape. Now, she thinks that nobody then has any right to use your kidneys unless you give them such a right. That crucially, this stems on the fact of consent, whether one consented to have their body used in such a way or not. If we would grant that, well, yeah, okay, the violinist needs to stay hooked up to you for them to survive, but if you never consented to that in the first place, well, then it's just a terrible situation. It's unfortunate, but there's no obligation that you have. Now we might say like you're an extraordinarily good person if you stay hooked up to them to help you, but you're not obligated to stay hooked up to the violinist. So she wants to see how we can compare this then to cases of abortion. Now, she says, ordinarily, to deprive someone of what they have a right to is to treat them unjustly. Now, there's an emendation, though. The right to life consists in the right not to be killed unjustly, not simply to not be killed. Right? We typically say that, well, someone is justified in killing someone else if it's in the case of self-defense or something like that. So the issue isn't just mere killing, but it's unjust killing. Now the question is whether abortion then is unjust killing. And there's 3 cases she wants to consider. The first, abortion in cases of self-defense, so to save the life of the mother. The second case, abortion in cases of rape. And the third case, abortion in cases of unwanted pregnancy. Now, in the first case, she says that the right to self-defense trumps right to life for others. We always say, typically, that anytime someone is, actively trying to kill you, and it looks like they're going to kill you, you have a right to stop them, and if the only way you can stop them is to kill them, then you're justified in doing so. That killing that person wouldn't be a case of unjust killing. Well, similarly, if it turns out that carrying a fetus with you, giving birth to it, could jeopardize your own life, could kill you, well, similarly then, it's not unjust to kill the fetus if it is a case of self-defense, if it is to save the life of the mother. So in this kind of an abortion, it's not an unjust killing. Case number 2, cases of rape. In this case, she says, the pregnancy was entirely involuntary. So just as in the case of the violinist, who was hooked up to you in the middle of the night without your consent, because you did not consent to it, you don't have a moral obligation to stay hooked up to the violinist, even though doing so would save the violinist's life. Similarly, if one was raped, they did not consent to carry a fetus, and therefore having an abortion is not a case of unjust killing if one was raped. Now, case number 3, though. What about instances where it was just merely an unwanted pregnancy? So it's not the case that it was rape, people were having sex, perhaps they were using contraception, but still that failed and they got pregnant anyways. What about in this kind of an instance? So here I want to look at this analogy called the people seeds analogy. Okay, in considering this people seeds analogy, she begins by saying there are cases, and cases in the details of these cases makes a difference. So if the room is stuffy, and I therefore open a window to air it, and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She's given him a right to the use of her house, for she is partially responsible for his presence there, having voluntarily done what enabled him to get in full knowledge that there are such things as burglars and that burglars burgle. It would be still more absurd to say this if I had bars installed outside my windows precisely to prevent burglars from getting in, and a burglar got in only because of a defect in the bars. It remains equally absurd, she says, if we imagine it is not a burglar who climbs in, but an innocent person who blunders or falls in. Again, suppose it were like this. People seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one people seed may drift in and take root in your carpets or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best that you can buy. As can happen, however, and on very, very rare occasions does happen, one of the screens is defective, and a seed drifts in and takes root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to the use of your house? Surely not. Despite the fact that you voluntarily opened your windows, you knowingly kept carpets and upholstered furniture, and you knew that screens were sometimes defective. Now, someone may argue that you are responsible for its rooting, that it does have a right to your house because, after all, you could have lived out your life with bare floors and furniture or with sealed windows and doors. But this won't do, for by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy, or anyway, by never leaving a home without a reliable army. So it seems to me, she says, that the argument we are looking at can establish at most that there are some cases in which the unborn person has a right to the use of its mother's body, and therefore some cases in which abortion is unjust killing. There is room for much discussion and argument as to precisely which, if any. But I think we should sidestep this issue, she says. Now, I think it's still worth considering what exactly these situations might be. So, most cases of abortion are not unjust killings, because most cases, let's say if you're using contraception or something like that, you're not intending to get pregnant, and you end up getting pregnant, we can't say it's your, you are responsible for carrying it to term, to giving birth to it, because you were not consenting to that in the first place, just as the case with the people seeds, since again, she would say, well, if you don't have a hysterectomy, then, you can't truly say, you had gotten rid of all risk of getting pregnant. And we would say it's absurd to say, well, unless one has gotten a hysterectomy, then they must, have consented to to carrying a child. So in those cases, it seems like, as long as I did not intend, I was not trying to get pregnant, I'm not morally obligated to carry it to term, and it is not an unjust killing to have an abortion. But it does seem to imply by her argument that I knew, perhaps I could get pregnant. I wasn't using contraception. Or maybe even I intended to have a child, but then I changed my mind. Those instances might not be just killings. Those might be unjust killings to have an abortion in those circumstances. Although admittedly, she does not follow through completely, to the full extent of this analogy. But suppose the violinist, going back to the violinist analogy, needed only an hour of your time. Or we could say then that pregnancy only lasted an hour. Would one, even if they did not consent to being hooked up to the violinist or did not consent to being pregnant, in those cases, would one have a moral obligation to be pregnant if it only lasted an hour? In Thomson's view, she says, even if the violinist only needs an hour, you still have a right to refuse. And the same is with pregnancy. Why? Because one did not consent. It's not about the time that's required. It's about consent. She says, except in such cases as the unborn person has a right to demand it, we were leaving open the possibility that there might be such cases. Nobody is morally required to make large sacrifices of health, of all other interests and concerns, of all other duties and commitments for 9 years or even for 9 months in order to keep another person alive. So no one has a moral obligation to perform these duties if they did not consent. So it doesn't matter the time that's required. A whole lifetime, a year, 9 months, 1 hour. If one did not consent, then it is not an unjust killing to have an abortion. Now she says there are moral degrees of Samaritanism. So we can say a good Samaritan is someone that goes beyond what is minimally morally required, whereas the minimally decent Samaritan does what is minimally morally required. The indecent Samaritan, then, is one that does not do what is minimally morally required. And we can use these 3 degrees to parse out moral obligation and when one is not merely just not blameworthy, but also their actions might be praiseworthy. So we might say the minimally decent Samaritan is one who perhaps, let's say, used contraception and then they got pregnant. Well, because they did not intend to get pregnant and they were using contraception, they would be justified in having an abortion. They would still be a minimally decent Samaritan. Let's say someone was not using contraception. They were just having sex whenever they wanted. They knew they could get pregnant. They did get pregnant. And, let's say furthermore that maybe even they intended to get pregnant. In those cases, to have an abortion they would be an indecent Samaritan. They would not be doing what is minimally morally required because they did not mitigate risks in any way. They knew what they were doing, and they even enabled themselves to get pregnant, knowing what would happen, or potentially wanted to get pregnant and then change their mind. Those cases of having an abortion, according to Thomson's argument, that would be morally blameworthy to have an abortion. Now, what about the good Samaritan? Someone that goes beyond what is minimally morally required. We might find these of instances of rape or of using contraception where one still gets pregnant and one decides to carry the child to term, to give birth. That would be something that is not morally required, but it's something morally praiseworthy. This would be an instance of a good Samaritan, of someone who goes beyond what is minimally morally required. It's very similar, I think, to what Aristotle talks about when he distinguishes between acts of justice and injustice and someone who goes beyond what mere justice requires. We would call that a decent person. Those kinds of actions would be morally praiseworthy. But we wouldn't blame someone for not going beyond what justice requires. Similarly, in these cases with abortion. So finally, we can see how exactly her argument works here in defense of abortion. So the first premise is that a human person has a right to bodily autonomy. The second premise, therefore, because a person has a right to bodily autonomy, a human person has no moral obligation to remain hooked up to a violinist to save their life without their consent. Now, third premise, assume a fetus is a human person and so generally has the right to life? Well, the fourth premise says that the violinist case shows a right to life does not necessarily trump the right to bodily autonomy. Number 5, the conclusion. Therefore, a mother generally has the right to refuse carrying a fetus to term due to the right to bodily autonomy, just as the same in the violinist case. Now, generally has the right to refuse carrying a fetus to term, right? So it might be the case, if I consent, if I sign a document that says, I will, agree to be hooked up to the violinist for 9 months to save the violinist's life, and then 8 months in, only 1 month left, I decide, no, I don't want to be hooked up anymore. That would not be morally permissible for me to just unhook myself once I had already committed to doing so. Similarly, I decide I want to, maybe try and have a child. I get pregnant, and then later I decide I don't want to have the child. An abortion would not be morally permissible in those kinds of cases. But generally, according to her argument, abortion is morally justifiable. Now, I think something to think about is whether, since it seems like the argument hinges on the violinist analogy, whether this is a weak or strong analogy. If it's a weak analogy, how might this affect her argument? Does she really need the violinist analogy? I also think it's important to consider whether or not we want to use this line of moral reasoning in all moral cases. This hinges on consent. And if one does not consent to something, then they never have a moral obligation. But what if, say, we are two astronauts and you get locked outside of the airlock and you're kind of floating in space and you're like, hey, I need you to press the button to let me inside the space station. Well, if I'd never consented to opening the door to let you inside the space station, to save your life, I'm not morally obligated. As long as I never said, yeah, I'll do that, I'm not morally obligated to let you into the space station to save your life because I never consented to, saying I would do that in the first place, right? That seems like maybe that's an extension of her argument. Is that acceptable? Would we want to take this line of moral reasoning to apply to all instances of life? If so, we might want to work that out. If not, what does that mean? Does that have any bearing on her argument? So, some questions to consider.